The morning the household at Renfield Hall turned her out, the frost had not yet left the gravel, and Eleanor Vance stood on the lowest step, with a single trunk at her feet, while the staff she had known for 6 years watched from the windows and said nothing. The Marquess had given the order at breakfast, his voice level, his eyes fixed on the window beyond her shoulder rather than on her face. She was to be gone by noon. There would be no carriage provided beyond the village, no letter of character, no further claim upon the protection her late father had been promised. The housekeeper had folded her hands and looked at the floor. The footman who had carried her trunk down had not met her eyes. And the Marquess himself, Julian Hartwell, the 7th Marquess of Renfield, had risen from the table before she could speak, his back to her, his shoulders set like a wall against the cold light. She had not wept. That was the thing the kitchen maids would remark on later, in the hush of the scullery, when the master had gone riding and the great house had exhaled around the absence of him. The ward had not wept. She had only stood very still, the way a person stands who has been struck and does not yet trust herself to move. And then she had bent and lifted the leather handle of her trunk with both hands, and the worn glove on her right hand had split along the seam, and she had looked at the split for a long moment, as though it were the only thing in the world that had finally told her the truth. To the household she was the charity case, the orphan, the old Marquess had taken in out of some debt of conscience nobody fully understood, kept on after his death, because turning her out would have looked unkind, and tolerated now by his heir, the way one tolerates a draft under a door. That was the verdict, and the verdict was wrong, and she had carried the proof of how wrong it was in the false bottom of that very trunk for 3 years without once being tempted to use it. Stay with her. You will want to be in the room when the house learns what she knew. She had come to Renfield at 19, the winter her father died. Thomas Vance had been a country attorney of modest practice and immodest honesty, and he had managed the affairs of the old Marquess for the better part of 2 decades, and when the fever took him in the space of a single week, the old Marquis had ridden through sleet to the small house on Miller's Lane, and stood in the parlor where the body lay, and made a promise to the daughter who had no one left. You will have a home for as long as you require one. He had said it plainly. An old man with gout and a wheezing chest, and a reputation for never giving his word twice. She had believed him. She had been right to. For 2 years the old Marquess had kept that word and more. He had given her the use of the small library off the morning room, and he had let her continue the careful copying and ordering of papers that her father had trained her to do, and on the long evenings when his heir was away in town, he had let her read to him from the estate ledgers and the legal correspondence. Small hand of the clerks, she had learned the shape of Renfield's affairs, the way another girl might have learned a piece of music, note by note, until she could have recited the encumbrances on every acre. She had learned something else as well, something she had filed away and never spoken of, because her father had taught her that a secret kept is a debt owed, and a debt owed must be honored even after the death of the man who held the note. Then the old Marquess had died too, in his sleep, the late autumn, and his son had come home from London to take up the title. Julian Hartwell had been a different creature from his father. Where the old man had been loose and warm and prone to long, unguarded talk, the son was contained, exact, and cold. In a way that the village decided very quickly was arrogance. He spoke little. He kept his accounts with a steward named Bramwell, and a man of business who came from town twice a year. And he did not ride out to the tenant cottages the way his father had, and he did not stand in the churchyard after services to be greeted. He had buried his father, and within a month he had reorganized the household, and within 2 he had begun, by small degrees, to make it understood that the charity of the previous Marquess was not necessarily the policy of the present one. Eleanor had felt the temperature drop around her like the first cold of a season changing. She had said nothing. She had only worked harder, copied more, made herself quieter and more useful, and tried not to notice the way the new Marquess sometimes stood at the door of the small library and watched her bent over the papers, as though she were a problem he had not yet decided how to solve. What she did not know, because his face never gave it, was that he watched her for an entirely different reason than the one she feared. The first time he spoke to her at any length was in the 3rd week after his father's funeral. She had been in the library after dark, a single candle at her elbow, copying a fair version of a tenancy agreement that Bramwell needed by morning, and she had not heard him come in. When she looked up, he was standing just inside the door with his greatcoat, still on the shoulders dark with rain, and his expression was the one the village called arrogance, and she was beginning to suspect was something else entirely. "You should not strain your eyes by one candle," he had said. The words came out flat, almost an accusation. She had risen at once and begun to apologize for being where she was, and he had cut across her with a single short sentence. "Sit down. Finish your work." She had sat. He had stood a moment longer, looking not at her, but at the page beneath her hand, and then he had turned and gone, and she had heard him give an order in the hall for 2 more candles to be brought to the library every evening. She had told herself it meant nothing. The candles came every evening after that. To Bramwell, the steward, she was a complication. He said so to the housekeeper one morning in the passage outside the still-room, not troubling to lower his voice, because he did not consider her worth the lowering of a voice. "The girl has no place here. Now the old man's gone," he had said. "A clerk's daughter playing at gentility, eating the master's bread and copying papers a hired man could do for 1/10 the trouble. Mark me, she will be gone by spring." Eleanor had been on the other side of the still-room door, with a basket of dried lavender in her hands, and she had stood very still until their footsteps faded, and then she had carried the lavender up to her room and laid it in her trunk, among the folded linens. Just above the false bottom where the folded document lay, that would have stopped Bramwell's mouth in an instant, if she had been the kind of person who used such things to wound. She was not that kind of person. That was her wound, if anyone had cared to look for it. Her father had raised her to believe that what one knew about another person's affairs was held in trust, not in reserve, and that the worth of a man or woman was measured precisely by what they refused to do with the power they happened to hold. She had watched him refuse, again and again, small advantages that would have eased their narrow life, because to take them would have meant betraying a confidence. He had died poor and unbending, and entirely himself. She had buried him with the conviction that she would rather be turned out of every house in England than become someone he would not have recognized. So she kept the document where it was, and she said nothing, and she let the household decide she was a charity case. And the cost of that silence was a thing she carried as quietly as she carried everything else. The witnessing came in the deep of that first winter, on an afternoon when the Marquess had ridden out toward the eastern farms and was not expected back before dark. A tenant's child had been sent up to the kitchen door with a message and had lingered half-frozen, too shy to knock, and Eleanor had found her there when she went out to fetch coal. The child was perhaps 7, the daughter of the Wickham family, whose lease was among the papers Eleanor had copied a dozen times, and she had a cough that rattled and no proper coat, and a message that her mother was abed and could not bring the rent on quarter day, and was afraid of what that would mean. Eleanor had brought the child inside, against every rule of the household. She had sat her by the kitchen fire, and given her broth, and wrapped her in her own shawl, and she had told her, kneeling so their eyes were level, that no one would be turned out for a late quarter day, that she would see to it herself. That the child was to tell her mother to rest, and not to be afraid. She had no authority to promise any such thing. She had promised it anyway, because the child was frightened and the promise was true in every way that mattered, except the one that could be enforced. What she did not know was that the Marquess had come back early, his horse gone lame on the eastern road, and that he had entered through the kitchen passage to avoid tracking mud through the front of the house, and that he had stopped in the dark of the passage and stood unseen for the whole of it. He had heard a clerk's orphan, with no power and no prospects, promise a frightened child the one thing the child needed, and he had watched her give away her own shawl, and he had seen her press the back of her hand to the child's hot forehead, with a tenderness that no one in that great cold house had shown him since his father died. He did not announce himself. He went up the back stairs and stood at the window of his study for a long time, and the next morning the Wickham rent was quietly forgiven for the quarter, and Bramwell was told to see a coat sent down to the cottage, and no one was told why. He had begun by then to do a great many things and tell no one why. The deniable attentions accumulated through the long middle of that winter and into the spring like snow that would not quite melt. When she took a chill from the draught in the small library, 2 more lamps appeared, and a screen was set against the window, and the Marquess remarked to no one in particular that the room had always been poorly built. When she was given the worst seat at the servants' table during a household dinner, by Bramwell's arrangement, the Marquess found occasion the following week to ask Miss Vance to take her meals in the morning room where the papers were, as it was more convenient to his correspondence, and the insult was undone without ever being named. When a length of decent muslin appeared among the household's purchases, more than the maids required, the housekeeper found a note in the Marquess's hand directing that Miss Vance was to have a new gown made up, as her duties brought her before the man of business, and the household ought not to appear to neglect her. Eleanor read each of these as the cold administration of a man who disliked untidiness. She did not let herself read them any other way. To read them otherwise would have been to hope, and hope was a luxury her father's daughter had learned to do without. Her body, though, had begun to know what her mind would not permit. She noticed when he entered a room before she heard him. She felt the air change. When he stood near her at the table over some question of the accounts, her pulse moved in her throat in a way she could not govern, and her hand, reaching for the inkwell, would steady itself against the edge of the desk, as though the desk might keep her honest. He gave commands, and she obeyed them, and told herself it was only obedience. Eat something. You have worked through the dinner hour. Sit down before you fall. Put on your wrap. The morning is cold, and you are no use to me ill. Each command was an order, and each order was a kindness, wearing the coat of an order. And the audience, to her own life, had there been one, would have seen the kindness plainly, while she saw only the cold. Then, at the turning of the year, the rival arrived. Lady Augusta Pembury came to Renfield in February with her mother, the Dowager Countess of Harborne, and a great quantity of trunks, ostensibly to escape the damp of their own house during repairs, and in truth to settle a question that the Dowager had decided some time ago must be settled. Lady Augusta was 23, polished to a high shine, accomplished in all the ways the season measured, and possessed of a face the village agreed was the handsomest seen at Renfield in a generation. The Dowager Countess had known the old Marquess, and had decided with the certainty of a woman who had never in her life been wrong about a thing that mattered to her, that her daughter and the new Marquess were to make a match, and that the only obstacle was the strange cold reticence of the man himself, which a determined campaign would surely thaw. She arranged herself in the best drawing-room like a general taking a field. It was the Dowager who first set the dismissive label loose in the house where it could be heard. She had taken in Eleanor at a glance on the first evening, the plain grey gown among the candlelight, the ink faintly staining the side of one finger, and she had turned to her daughter and said, in the carrying voice of a woman who did not care who heard, that she had not realized the Marquess kept a clerk about the place in skirts and that it was a pity, really, the lengths a charitable family would go to, and that the girl ought to be found a respectable situation in some other county before she became an embarrassment. Eleanor had been crossing the room with a folder of papers for the Marquess. She had not slowed her step. She had felt the heat climb her neck, and had kept her face composed, and had set the folder down at the Marquess's elbow and withdrawn, and only when she was through the door had she let her hand press flat against the cool plaster of the corridor wall until the trembling stopped. The Marquess had said nothing in the moment. 2. She had seen, though, before she turned away, that his jaw had set in a particular way, and that he had not looked at Lady Augusta once for the remainder of that evening, though the Dowager had arranged a great deal of music for him to admire. The midpoint of that long winter brought the thing she had not expected, which was the truth of him. It came to her not through any confidence he offered, but through a single hour she was not meant to witness. She had gone up late to return a ledger to the study, and had found the door ajar and the Marquess within, and he had not heard her. She had stopped on the threshold the way he had once stopped on hers. He was standing before the cold hearth, with a small portrait in his hand, turned to the firelight, and his face, which the village called arrogance, and she had called cold, was the face of a man looking at a grief he had not set down in a very long time. She had learned later, in pieces, what the portrait was. It was his younger brother Edmund, dead these 4 years in the war on the peninsula, a boy of 20 who had bought his commission against the family's wishes with money. The old Marquess had refused him, and that Julian, then merely the heir, had quietly supplied. He had given his brother the means to go to war because his brother had begged him, and because he had loved him and had not been able to bear refusing him. And his brother had died of it. The cold, the village mistook for arrogance, was the discipline of a man who had decided in the worst hour of his life that he would never again let his own wanting cost another person their safety, and who had built a wall around himself, stone by stone, so that no one he might come to care for. He kept his brother's portrait turned to the wall most days. That night he had turned it to the light, and Eleanor had withdrawn without a sound, and she had carried the knowledge of it down the stairs as carefully as she carried the document in her trunk, one more secret held in trust. After that, she could not unknow him. The cold was a room he lived in, not a thing he was, and once she had seen the man inside the room she could not stop seeing him. And that was its own kind of danger, because a woman who pities a man is in some peril, but a woman who understands one is in a great deal more. Spring came on, and with it the dowager's campaign hardened into strategy. She had come to understand, with the swift instinct of her kind, that the obstacle to her daughter's match was not the Marquess's reticence in general, but his attention to one particular gray-gowned figure in specific, and she set herself to remove the obstacle. She began with small public cuts. She arranged the seating so that Eleanor was always at the farthest remove. She let fall, at a dinner where the man of business and 2 neighboring families were present, the second voicing of the label, more polished and more poisonous than the first. She had heard, she said, that the late Marquess had been imposed upon in his last years by a designing girl of no family who had wormed her way into the management of his papers, and that it was fortunate indeed the present Marquess was too sensible a man to be taken in by the same arts. For there is nothing so dangerous to a great house as a clever woman of low birth who knew where the documents were kept. She had smiled at Eleanor as she said it. Eleanor had sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on her plate, and had not given the table the satisfaction of a single tremor, though the wine in her untouched glass had shivered once when her knee struck the table leg, and the Marquess at the head of the table had set down his fork with a quietness that was louder than any word. He had walked with her in the garden the following morning, ostensibly to discuss a question of the Eastern leases, in truth for a reason neither of them named. The walk had been mostly silent. At the turn by the rose arbor where the canes were only just greening he had stopped, and he had looked at her for a long moment, and he had seemed about to say a thing for which there was no precedent in their cold acquaintance. His hand had lifted as though to touch her sleeve, and had stopped in the air a hand's breadth from her arm, and had returned to his side. "I would not have you troubled by what is said in this house," he had said at last, and the words were stiff and inadequate, and the most that his discipline would permit him. She had understood, with the part of her that had seen the portrait, exactly how much they cost. She had said only that she was not easily troubled, which was a lie they both let stand, and they had walked on, and the space where his hand had almost been seemed to burn on her sleeve for the rest of the day. She wanted him. She admitted it to herself that night, alone, in the small, cold room at the top of the house, with a directness that frightened her more than any of the dowager's barbs. It was not gratitude, and it was not the soft warmth of being looked after. It was want, plain and unsanctioned, for a particular man who could not in any rational world be hers, and she lay awake with her heart going hard against her ribs. and understood that she had let herself walk into the one disaster her father had never thought to warn her of. She resolved to leave. She would find a situation, as the Dowager had so kindly suggested, in some other county, and she would go before the wanting could cost either of them anything, because she had seen what the fear of cost had done to the man downstairs, and she would not be the instrument of more of it. She had decided this with her whole will, and then the household decided it for her, and decided it cruelly, and took even the dignity of leaving on her own terms out of her hands. It happened over the matter of a brooch. Lady Augusta discovered a jeweled brooch missing from her dressing table on a morning when the household was at sixes and sevens, and the Dowager, who had been waiting for precisely such an opening, or one near enough to serve, made certain within the hour that the whole house understood whom she suspected. A clever girl of low birth, after all, who knew the value of things and had grown used to a comfort she could not expect to keep. The brooch was found that afternoon fallen behind the dressing table where a careless maid had knocked it, and the Dowager offered no apology, only a thin smile and the observation, made to the housekeeper and the third voicing of the label, and certain to be carried to the Marquess, that whether the girl had taken the thing or not, when a house that kept such a person about it would always be subject to such doubts, and that no prudent master would tolerate the risk. It was this, the manufactured doubt, the poison that could not be disproved because it had never been an accusation of fact, that the Marquess was made to weigh. And here the thing turned in a way that broke her, because he did not defend her. Not then. The Dowager had been too clever for that. She had arranged matters so that to defend the ward openly would be to confirm an attachment that would ruin both the ward and himself in the eyes of the county, and the Marquess, who had built his whole life around the principle that his caring must never endanger the person he cared for, did the thing his discipline demanded. He resolved to send her away. He told himself it was for her protection, that she could not be safe in a house where the Dowager had marked her, that a clean break in a settlement quietly arranged through his man of business would free her from the poison and let her begin somewhere the label could not follow. He told himself all of it. He gave the order at breakfast with his eyes on the window, because he could not give it to her face. He did not tell her his reasons, because to tell her would have been to say the thing he had forbidden himself to say. He let her believe she was being cast out, as the household believed she was being cast out. The charity case finally found inconvenient, and he stood with his back to her, so that she would not see what it cost, and in protecting her by his own cold logic, he wounded her more deeply than the Dowager had managed in a whole winter of trying. So she stood on the frost-cold step, with the split glove and the single trunk, and the household watched from the windows, and she lifted the trunk and turned toward the long drive. And that was the moment the document in the false bottom became the only thing she had left, and the one thing she had sworn never to use. She walked as far as the village. She took a room above the posting inn on the strength of the few coins sewn into her hem, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed with the trunk before her, and for the first time in 3 years, she opened the false bottom and took out the folded paper, and read it again by the gray window light, though she had long since known every word. It was a deed. It was the deed, in fact, to Renfield Hall itself, and the home farm, and the eastern acres drawn up and properly witnessed in the last year of the old Marquess's life, and it conveyed the freehold of the core of the estate not to his son and heir, who would inherit the title and the entailed lands regardless, and the deed named the trustee, and the trustee was Thomas Vance, her father, and upon his death his heir, her. The old Marquess, in his careful, unsentimental way, had foreseen that an entail could be broken and an estate stripped by a profligate heir or a determined creditor, and he had placed the heart of Renfield beyond the reach of any such disaster by putting its freehold into the honest hands of the only man he had ever fully trusted, with instructions that it be held quietly, used only if the house were ever truly threatened, and conveyed to the Marquess outright, once the heir had proved himself a steady steward of it. Her father had held it in trust. She had inherited the trust, along with everything else her father was. The Marquess did not know it existed. By the strict letter of that deed, the man who had turned her out that morning did not own the house he had turned her out of. She did. She could have ruined him. She sat with the deed in her hands, and understood with perfect clarity exactly how completely she could ruin him, and exactly how richly the dowager's poison and his own cold cruelty had earned it. And she found, examining her own heart by the gray window light, she wanted him to be the steady steward the deed required. She wanted the house to be safe in his hands. She wanted more than she had wanted anything since her father died. To be the kind of person who held a power like this and refused, again, to use it as a weapon, because that refusal was the last thing she owned that her father would have recognized. So she folded the deed again, and she did not take it to a lawyer, and she did not send word to the dowager. She wrote instead a single short letter to the Marquess's man of business, a Mr. whom she had met across the morning-room table a dozen times and whom she knew to be honest. And she asked him to call upon her at the inn on a matter touching the late Marquess's intentions for the estate, and she sealed it, and she sent it by the inn's boy, and then she waited, because she had decided that the deed would do its work in the open and the daylight, before witnesses, or it would not do its work at all. Mr. Coombe came the next morning. He read the deed 3 times. He grew very pale, and then very still. And then he said, in the voice of a man who has just watched the ground rearrange itself beneath his feet, that the document was genuine beyond any question, that he recognized the old Marquess's hand and the seals of the witnesses, both of whom were respectable men still living. He asked her what she intended. She told him. She intended that he should bring it to the Marquess and to the witnesses, and that it should be confirmed in proper form, and that the freehold should be conveyed to the Marquess outright as the old man had wished, on the single condition that he hear from her own mouth, before whatever company the dowager had assembled for her triumph. Why she had not used it to destroy him, Mr. Coombe looked at her as though he had never in his long career met anyone quite like her. He said he would arrange it. He said the Dowager Countess was, as it happened, giving a large dinner at Renfield in 3 days' time, to which half the county had been invited, and at which it was widely understood an announcement concerning Lady Augusta was expected. Eleanor said that would do very well. She would come to the dinner. She would come to the same room where she had been called a clerk in skirts and a designing girl of no family, and she would let the truth be confirmed there, in front of the people who had delivered the verdict, and then she would let the Marquess decide for himself what kind of steward he meant to be. The night of the dinner, the great drawing-room at Renfield was lit by every candle the house possessed, and the long table seated 30, and the Dowager Countess sat near the head of it in claret silk and the Harborne diamonds, with her daughter beside her in white, and the talk ran bright and shallow over the soup and the fish. And the Marquess sat at the head of his own table looking like a man attending his own sentencing. He had not been himself, the servant said afterward, since the morning the ward was sent away. He ate nothing. He answered when spoken to and not before. And when the doors at the far end of the room opened, between the fish and the meat, and Mr. Coombe was announced, and behind Mr. Burse, Coombe came a woman in a plain gray gown, with her chin level and a folded paper in her gloved hand. The whole bright, shallow run of talk stopped as though a hand had been laid across the throat of the room. The dowager rose halfway from her chair. She said the girl's name is a curse, and then she said, into the silence, the only weapon she had left, that this was an outrage, that a dismissed servant had no business in a gentleman's house, that someone should call the footman. No one moved. Mr. Coombe stepped forward into the candlelight, and in the dry, steady voice of a man of business reading a fact into a room, he stated that he held a deed, witnessed and genuine, conveying the freehold of Renfield Hall and its principal lands into a trust established by the late Marquis, and that the trustee, by inheritance, was the woman standing beside him, and that the present Marquess held the house he sat in by her sufferance and had done so. Unknowing, for the whole of his tenure. The diamonds at the dowager's throat trembled. Lady Augusta's painted composure cracked down the middle like ice over a river. And the Marquess rose slowly from his chair at the head of the table and looked at Eleanor, down the whole long blazing length of it, and his face, for the first time in the sight of any person in that room, was open. She spoke before he could. She had earned the right to speak first, and she took it. She said that she had held the deed for 3 years and had told no one. She said that she could have used it the morning she was turned out, and had not. She said that her father had taught her that a thing held in trust is not a thing to be used as a knife, and that she had come tonight not to take the house, but to give it freely into the hands of the man the old Marquess had hoped his son would become, and that she asked nothing in return but that the truth be known in the room where the lies had been told. Then she set the deed down upon the white cloth among the silver and the candle flames, and she stepped back, and she let the silence do the rest. The Marquess came down the length of the table. He did not hurry. 30 faces turned to follow him, and he did not look at one of them. He stopped before her closer than propriety allowed, and the candlelight was full on his face, and there was nothing cold in it at all. For a long moment he said nothing, and the room held its breath, and the dowager's hand was frozen halfway to her diamonds, and Lady Augusta had gone the color of the cloth. Then he said it. "Marry me, Eleanor, and the house is ours." The given name landed in the silence like a stone into still water, the first time he had ever used it, and it told the room everything the deed had not. The Dowager Countess sat down very suddenly. Somewhere among the 30, a woman made a small sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. And Eleanor Vance, who had not wept on the cold step 3 days before, who had not wept in 6 years of being decided about by people who had never once asked, felt her composure go all at once, and did not fight it, because there was finally a reason worth the loss of it. She did not answer in words. She put her hand, the one in the split glove she had never mended, into his, and that was answer enough for the whole county to carry home. The dowager and her daughter were gone from Renfield by the following noon, removed, not by any cruelty, but by the simple impossibility of remaining, and the county, which had taken the dowager's word all winter, took the truth now with the same easy certainty, and began at once to remember that they had always thought there was something fine about the gray-gowned girl. Mr. Combe drew up the conveyance in proper form within the week. The freehold passed to the Marquess outright, as the old man had wished, with one alteration that Julian insisted upon and Eleanor did not refuse, which was that it should pass to them jointly, so that the house she had given back would be hers in law, as it had become hers in every other way. The autumn of that year came on gold and quiet, and on an evening near its end the new Marchioness of Renfield sat in the small library off the morning room, the room where 2 more candles had once appeared every evening for reasons she had refused to understand, and the fire was lit and the rain was soft on the dark glass. And her husband came in without his greatcoat, and stood a moment in the door the way he had used to stand watching her. On the table at her elbow lay the worn glove with the split seam, kept now not for use, but for memory, the small, honest evidence of the morning everything had begun to come right by first going wrong. Beside it, where she had set it that afternoon, stood the small portrait of his brother Edmund, turned at last to the light, where she had told him gently that it should always stay, because a grief looked at in the warmth of a lit room is a different thing from a grief turned to the wall. He crossed the room, and put his hand on her shoulder, and she covered it with her own, and neither of them spoke, because the house was quiet around them and safe in theirs, and there was nothing left that needed saying. She had been turned out of that house on a frost-cold morning, the charity case, the clerk in skirts, the designing girl of no family, and she had walked back into it carrying the one thing that proved how wrong the world had been, and she had given it away rather than wield it. And in the giving, she had become at last what she had always been, and no one had troubled to see. Outside the dark window, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, settling soft and white over the gardens and the gravel and the lowest step where a trunk had once stood, and inside the firelight the worn glove lay still upon the table. and the portrait faced the warm room. And the woman the world had decided not to see sat in her own home at last and watched the snow come down. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If it moved you, leave a quiet word below and tell me the moment that stayed with you.